So you're welcome to AFROSAI-E's third webinar on root cause analysis. We want to focus on the fishbone analysis, and we are focusing this not necessarily for auditors who want to venture into SDG audits, but also look at it as an analysis tool for all kinds of audits, putting your thoughts together and putting all all your findings, ranking them into cause effects and making it useful for an audit report. Remember, these days, we don't just want to write audits or do audits because we have to do them. We want to do these audits because they add value, and we want to put in value-adding audits. So I'm going to share the slide quickly on the screen while I invite our speaker for today, Mr. John Affleck. John is a consultant with the CAF program. He will be in the right position to do a more precise introduction of himself. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite Mr. John Affleck to take us through this one.
Senior positions at the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, and I worked in the domain of performance audit. So yeah, I really enjoyed performance audit. A couple of quick comments there. You know, I always felt that you're always on a learning curve when you're doing it because your subject always changes. That's fascinating. And you have an outside chance to make a difference. And several of my audits that I completed did make a substantive difference. So great career, retired in 2017. And since then, I've been really busy acting as a consultant. And as mentioned earlier, I'm an associate with the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation. So next slide, please. The international component of the foundation is sponsored by Global Affairs Canada. So we always try and acknowledge that. Our current international program, we're dealing with Rwanda. I travel there a fair bit, as well as Vietnam and Guyana and Senegal. And the program's coming to a close in February of 25. And then we're trying to secure more funding for a program that will focus on the Indo-Pacific. So it's quite exciting here. So one of my specialties is root cause analysis. I actually designed the course for the foundation, and I'm currently in the process of updating it. And I'm actually updating it with case studies that relate to vulnerable populations so that we can use the course material in the context of the international environment. So the next slide, please. Yeah, you know, I was talking with Richard before we decided to go ahead with this webinar, and Richard had mentioned that, you know, you guys have done some SDG audits, and so I've just put them up there to remind myself what they were. And you know, a key challenge of these audits are, you know, how do you get focused? They're really, really big. Some of you may know my wife, actually, Kimberly Leach. She was down in South Africa in early August at the Climate Scanner Conference. And that's her specialty is SDG. So I asked her, I said, so, you know, what's really the difference between an SDG audit and a regular performance audit? And the answer is there's not really that much difference. It just depends how you scope it. So are you referencing one of the SDG goals in your audit? Are you doing a line of inquiry where one of those lines of inquiries is a specific target or a specific goal? Or is in fact your audit objective exclusively focused around a particular SDG or one of the you know, the targets related to that? So it can be a range. It just really depends on how you scope it, but the methodology generally stays the same when you approach these audits. And I know for a fact that in Canada, in the Office of the Auditor General, they drive the SDG goals through each of their performance audit. It's a mandatory thing that when you make an audit proposal that you have to indicate which SDG you're addressing and the extent to which you're doing that. So yeah, so when you get into these goals and at this, particularly at the goal level, looking at this slide here, ensure access to water and sanitation for all, it's huge. Like, so how do you get focused? So I think, the fishbone diagram, we'll go to the next slide, please. It's one of many root cause analysis tools, but it's a great tool, and it can help you organize your thinking. The fishbone, you'll see in the literature, sometimes it's called the Ishikawa diagram because it was created by a Japanese fellow called Karo Ishikawa. And it's been used for many, many decades, really, in the private sector and the manufacturing in particular for product design and how to sort of prevent defects and how to solve problems. And as I mentioned, it is a root cause analysis tool. And what it does more than anything is it helps organize your discussion and keep you focused, and really helps to crystallize your analytical reasoning and your critical thinking and that sort of thing. So I always say, when we teach root cause analysis, there's many tools out there, and the fishbone's one of them. And the fishbone diagram doesn't really get you at the root cause per se. You can't sort of go through this analysis and say, okay, I have the root cause of the problem. But what it does do, excuse me, is it allows you to sort of lay out in a visual way. It's a visual tool, excellent for briefing, by the way, excellent for team building. We can get into that. By the way, I've left a lot of time here for questions at the end, and I can answer any questions related to, well, how do you actually apply it and what's the best stage of the audit to do it, etc. So we can get into that a bit later. But again, what it does is it's a visual thing. So it promotes the system thinking through these visual linkages. And, it can allow you to sort of sit back and go, okay, we're very strong here, or we're weaker here. Maybe we need to do a bit more work in this area, etc. So you get kind of a sort of more of a 6,000-foot view of what's going on when you have multiple findings and you're trying to focus where you want to pursue further audit work. It can also help you prioritize and then, as I mentioned, take corrective action. Sometimes when you're doing a performance audit and you realize that your story is emerging and you have a bunch of audit programs, and a lot of people feel compelled, well, we got to finish this audit program. Excuse me. As long as you put a note to file and explain the reason why you're not going to continue to pursue a different avenue, that's fine. You don't have to go down a rabbit hole and continue to do something if it's not going to make your audit report. So that's where a fishbone can be helpful. It can sort of direct you that way. So, excuse me. So the problem, and we'll see the schematic in a minute, but it's placed at the head of the fish. So the problem statement could be, a main finding. It could be a main message emerging. It's not really that important, but you have to kind of organize your inputs related to whatever you put at the head of the fish. And we call the main categories of the root causes the bones. And again, we're going to see a picture of a fishbone in a second. And then you place the secondary causes under these main categories. And the main categories are really the key to the fishbone analysis. So next slide, please. In the manufacturing sector, the main categories are often referred to as things like machine, method, materials, measurement, people, environment. When I first started teaching this course, I used a sort of very, not really an audit related example, but a very simple example of shooting free throws in a basketball game. When you get a penalty and then the team gets to shoot some free throws from the free throw line. I use that as a very simple example. And, when I looked at, okay, well, what's the machine? What's the method? What's the materials? Well, the machine would be the person shooting. The method would be, the skills that they would take to learn how to shoot these shots accurately. Materials, what's the ball made out of? The person itself, the environment. Maybe it could be an outdoor basketball game. Anyway, so I use this very simple example in the context of a manufacturing sector to sort of explain what the fishbone's all about. So again, next slide, please, and we'll see this is what the fishbone looks like. And this is the fishbone diagram with those categories from the manufacturing sector. Excuse me. So I think the biggest value added of the foundation was to take a look at this fishbone and say, well, that's nice, but how do I relate that in the context of a performance audit? Like, how do I actually use this thing when I conduct a performance audit? So next slide, please. So the foundation came up with their own main categories in replacing those categories that are used in the manufacturing sector. So you can see that there's 7 categories, and with culture in the center. So we have 3 categories on the right-hand side: authority, process and planning, oversight, and performance reporting. And these are referred to as governance related. And on the left-hand side, you have 3 categories that are operations related. And these relate to findings related to people, to assets, and to delivery. And often we find in Canada, North America anyways, the majority of your findings will be related to the governance side. You'll have most of your performance audit findings related to those 3 categories on the right: the authority, process and planning, and oversight. But it's interesting because when I teach in developing countries, often the findings are related to assets and often to the underutilization of assets. Like in Rwanda, for example, they bought this big garbage incinerator, but they didn't have the proper training of the people to operate it properly. So it depends on the context. And you can see the 7th category is culture, and we put that in the middle because it's kind of pervasive, and it is an emerging field in performance audit at the moment. And the culture of it's pervasive. It runs through, and often you'll find that the root cause of many of your performance audit findings, culture, is at the center of it. Okay, so I could stop there and take questions, but I don't have too many more slides, so I think I'll keep going and take the questions at the end. But again, these 7 categories are the key, because all of your findings in a performance audit, and we've test-driven this model a lot. And I'll say to people when we initially started teaching this subject, say, so any categories missing? And there are some pretty interesting suggestions. What about corruption, for example? Well, we could argue we could fit that, and we did under culture if need be. But there were other interesting comments. What about risk analysis? What about information management? How do you fit that into this particular model? But, by and large, we could see that it works and we can find a home in it. So we'll just dive into that a little bit here in the next slide. We'll take a look at the governance-related findings, and many of these will relate to your work, I'm sure. Next slide. And click again, please. Okay, so we'll take a look at the authority ones. Again, these are the categories on the governance related. So things like, there was no authority for the program, it was absent, or no clear direction for the delivery or the reporting, and no mandate. The mandate wasn't clear. Some of the government structures were weak or inappropriate or non-existent. So these should resonate because we often in our performance audits find issues related to authority. In terms of process and planning, big one as well, the processes are not established or unclear. And this is another big one: strategic and operational plans are not developed and not approved, or they're not SMART. So you probably know that acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And then finally, in the governance-related category, we have oversight. So oversight bodies are not carrying out their assigned functions. Outcomes aren't established. Performance is not measured, or often not reported, or the information that's required is not defined or provided. So I often find when we find findings in oversight, it usually, sometimes and quite often, is the root cause of things. Because if you don't have proper oversight and you're not carrying out those functions properly, then a lot of other problems are related to that. Okay, so those are the three governance ones. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And we'll look at the operations related. So here, again, we have three categories: people, excuse me, so the right people, not at the right time and the right place. You know, often things related to HR, like succession planning, you know, retention strategies, hiring process not objective, that sort of thing, unclear roles, responsibilities, not having the necessary competencies or the skills in place. And of course, the supervision and the performance appraisal process is also often one of the main HR functions that we come across that's not working properly. In terms of assets, and I mentioned this before in the context of the developing countries, often these are assets that the findings are not that they don't have the assets, but they have the assets and they're not properly utilized, or the skills aren't there to properly operate them. And finally, delivery, and this really relates to continuous improvement, you know, so you don't have the monitoring and the control of the inputs and the activities, outputs, outcomes, that sort of thing. And often we find findings related to the delivery. And you can see that here we have strategic and operational plans not implemented. We talked about plans in the previous categories when we talked about process and planning. And I'll speak to that in a sec. Like sometimes the findings that you have don't fit neatly into one of these categories, but that's not really a problem where you put it exactly. But keep in mind that, you know, it's a model. So the model is here to help organize your thinking. It's not necessarily meant to be definitive. So, you know, one finding could belong professional judgment in one or more categories. And finally, in terms of culture, interesting, you can actually audit culture. And it's a very interesting topic because we often find that the root cause of many problems in performance audit is in fact related to culture. Some of the big industrial accidents, for example, you know, the aircraft that went down in Indonesia where everyone was killed, and then the same Boeing Air Max 737 Max 8, that plane, it went down in Ethiopia. And huge root cause analysis on that in terms of, you know, was it pilot error? Was it mechanical? Was it training, software? You know, a lot of possibilities, and the number of them came into play. But the bottom line was it was a cultural thing at Boeing. You know, they were obsessed with profit and turning out more aircraft, and they overlooked important safety components. So again, you know, the same thing with the El Mocambo oil well in the Gulf of Mexico that blew up. And, you know, it was a cultural thing related to not only the people on the oil rig in the Gulf, but also in the offices back in London and BP. Another example comes to mind is the space shuttle that blew up. And, you know, when they tried to do root cause analysis and get to the bottom, it was interesting how pervasive culture was. So just wanted to emphasize that in performance audits, keep an eye out for that. And to date, it's kind of been, well, how do you start, even begin to audit that? Well, you can look at things like you know, correspondence from the president. Is it inappropriate, or is it inconsistent? What's going on? There should be, policies in place that define the expected behaviors. Maybe their recruiting process is not objective or based on merit principle. What about the training to teach people about, you know, proper behavior? And are there incentives in place or disincentives to discourage inappropriate behavior? Do they monitor and enforce policies to ensure those things take place? Wrong behaviors that might be tolerated by managers, or often in an organization, there's these subpopulations or cultures that may not be aligned properly with the overall corporate culture. So you can audit it. A bit tricky. The key is you need to think about this early. If you're going into an organization, and I've audited many regulatory agencies in particular that have very strong corporate cultures. So if you think it might be an issue in terms of your performance audit, you need to build that in early. and put it part of your audit plan. You can't trip across it and have recommendations at the end if you haven't really structurally built that into your audit. So again, we have the 6 categories: authority, process planning, oversight, reporting, that are governance. We have the 3 operations: the people, assets, and delivery. And then we have this culture category that runs through it all. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, not all main categories or all those indicators that we looked at will apply to each audit that you're doing. And some of the findings and the causes of those findings may be exchangeable from one or another. They're not mutually exclusive, and some of them can cut across categories. But again, it's a very good model, and again, tested in the field, and has proven that, yeah, it works. It is a good way to organize your thinking. So this is my last slide here, and this is the fishbone again, but now we've populated it with the categories that the foundation has come up with. So instead of those categories from the manufacturing sector, now we have authority, process and planning, oversight, and then the bottom, people, assets, delivery, and the culture. You can see the sort of the orange squares or the tan squares that run through the spine of the fish. And at the right-hand side is where you'd put, your significant finding that you're trying to resolve, or the main message of the report. And you populate this diagram in the boxes that say cause, and those are just examples. There could be 3, there could be 10, there could be 1, or it could be none. And when you are conducting your audit, you populate the fishbone for further analysis with your findings. And what this does is it allows you to see sort of proportionally where your findings are landing. It doesn't really give you a sense of risk or impact, so you may want to color them differently, or some way be able to indicate, the significance of those findings. But it certainly gives you a really good visual of what your audit is about, where your findings are generally landing, where you may need to do more work, and what's your story that's emerging, and where you may want to actually, as I said, do more work and sort of develop that further. So it helps to kind of in mid-course sort of do mid-course correction in terms of, oh, I see here, we got some big issues of authority here. We just don't have the mandates in place to do A, B, C. And this is really at the root cause of our problem, we think. So I think we need to dig a bit deeper into that. And that's going to become how we organize our report and how we're going to tell the story of this particular issue that we're auditing. So excellent. In summary, again, I mentioned it's a visual tool. It won't spoon feed you in terms of how to get to the specific root cause of a particular issue, but it will allow you to organize a multitude of findings, to categorize them, and then to sort of sit back for further analysis in terms of what is this telling us? How are we going to tell? I always refer to it as the story, and what's the overall message, what's the key messages that are emerging, and what are the significant audit findings that are supporting those key messages. So I've talked a lot, but that's kind of it in a nutshell. And again, this fishbone diagram is not just unique to SD audits. It can be used in any performance audit. And it's one of several tools, but an excellent visual tool to help you organize your critical thinking and to draw those linkages. And it can be done. I always tell teams, I think the best time to do this is to bring your team members together about midpoint exam to see what's happening. Great team building tool as well, because you get your team members around the table and they can, contribute to the population of this diagram. And then, at the end of the day, if you're briefing the auditor general or anybody for that matter, it allows you to present what you're finding in sort of a one pager and say, here's the big picture, here's our main message, and this is the reason why we're going this way, because these are the significant findings that support that message. Okay, so there you go. With that, I think the next slide, I've just got questions. So I'll take any questions you have or provide some further elaboration if need be, and I'll just open the floor.
John, we already have some questions coming in on the chat. The first one is from Joseph asking, why is culture treated as the main bone in the fishbone diagram?
Well, it's a good question. It's because culture can be pervasive. So if you do find findings in that area, they could have an influence on a number of different things. So it could have an impact into how your hiring process is. If there's nepotism going on or something going on, that it might have an impact in terms of corruption, in terms of how your contracts are established, etc. I'm doing as I mentioned to you before, I'm recreating a fishbone diagram for the course that we can use in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of addressing the main theme of that program, which would be vulnerable populations. So I was looking at a case study to use, and I'm designing one on housing. And when we looked at the cultural aspects, there was a belief in the organization about housing that they really didn't need an overarching policy framework, thought it was a waste of time, or there was a belief that it wasn't their responsibility, the leading department, to do specific things. Well, this, would be plotted then on the spine, so to speak, because it had a major influence. When you have a sort of mentality within an organization that it's a waste of time, or we don't do this, or it's not our responsibility, well, that can have an impact on several things. So that's the reason why we decided, for better or for worse, to put it down the middle.
Thank you, John. We have another question coming in from Kulwa Kija asking, after all the analysis of the different causes using fishbone, how do you come into conclusion that this is the root cause?
Well, that's a really good question. And again, there's other tools. When you do root cause analysis, you rarely rely on one particular tool to do that. And as I've mentioned, the fishbone doesn't really provide a lot of guidance there in terms of specifically identifying what is the key thing here that is leading you to the root cause. And so in combination with this, it's not too dissimilar to your problem tree. We do something called cause mapping, which is a bit more sophisticated, a bit more complex. Those large industrial accidents I refer to often use the cause mapping tool as the primary way to identify root cause. And there's a whole bunch of other things as well, like the 5 whys, et cetera. So my answer would be it's in addition to other tools that you would use to come to that. But I think one thing it does do, though, is, it will precipitate those discussions. And for example, if you create your fishbone, you're doing some SD audit and you got so many findings and you populate it, and then you realize it's hard to do sometimes if you don't sort of sit down and try to organize it in a way that you see how the findings may be interrelated. And let's say, for example, you are finding that you've got a number of findings in oversight and performance reporting and hardly anything in terms of delivery or people. And so, you're sort of warming into that, okay, well, perhaps there is something here in oversight and performance reporting. It is the majority of our findings. And you can dig down and then apply some of these other root cause analysis tools to those findings to see, okay, I'm pretty convinced, by the way, that this is in fact the root cause of the issue here. But it's just a springboard to help you further with that analysis.
Thank you, John. So Richard actually has a question on, is culture auditable? The issues that have to do with attitudes, behaviors, etc. How do we go about this area?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, that's why the slide that we showed there on culture, we talked about some possible angles to do that. Like, as I mentioned, I found in my own personal experience that dealing with some of the regulatory agencies, in Canada, they had a mission, and were they completely, I don't want to name any names here, but were they completely objective and biased, or were they objective and fair, or were they biased and sort of lean towards a particular view of a sensitive issue that could be very polarized and hard to get at, but if you sort of draw different angles to that, what's the communication from the president like, or did you, for example, discover anything in terms of their HR practices where things weren't exactly correct, and the executive table is populated with people that all know each other, are related in the same family. So there are things, it depends in terms of what you anticipate the cultural issue may be. I mean, attitudes is one thing, that's fine, but does it really translate into things that have inappropriately sort of changed decision making and behavior within the organization? I think a lot of it does relate to the policies that are in place, like code of conduct, professional behavior, that sort of thing. And are they communicated? Are they monitored? Are they enforced? That sort of thing. So it will depend on what your cultural issue is. But the key is, as I mentioned earlier, is to think that through. If in fact you have some sort of suspicion, or you've heard, or you think that is going to be an issue in the organization that you're looking at, then you need to preempt that at the beginning and build maybe a line of inquiry into your audit to sort of get at that. So at the end of the day, if you determine that this had a cultural was a big player in what you're observing, you can't just make a recommendation to do something. I'll give you a good example where that actually happened was in Canada. They centralized the payroll system in the federal government, huge thing. And it was done in Australia as well, but it was a fiasco in Australia, and Canada didn't learn from the lessons, and we went ahead and implemented the system, and people weren't getting paid. People were getting paid too much, which was a problem because then it screwed up all your income tax returns and all that stuff. People were losing their houses. Like, this was a major thing, and it's still going on. 7 years later, civil servants in Canada are still impacted by this decision. And I remember it bothered the Auditor General a lot. And he said, how can it be possible in a system where we have all these checks and balances? We have internal audit, we've got frameworks in place, we've got monitoring, we've got all these policies in place. Like, how could this happen? And he wrote, it was controversial at the time, but he wrote a reflection piece that front-ended his annual report. And he reflected on this particular situation, this incomprehensible failure, as he referred to it as. And he concluded that it was a cultural issue, of risk avoidance and not wanting to inform people of bad news and just carrying on with a project knowing full well that it was off the rails. So, but that was concluded by the Auditor General sort of like almost like an op-ed piece. He was musing out loud, but after the fact. So the audit itself didn't get at that, but it was something that the Auditor General himself reflected on and concluded that this is at the root cause of this particular issue. So if you're kind of got these suspicions at the beginning of your audit that this is in fact something that's going to influence what you're observing, then you need to think through how you may want to build that in at the beginning of your audit.
Thank you, John. So we've got a question from Pauline, and I think it also links up to another question by Kulwa, asking, how does one link the different causes from the fins into the main fishbone that is linked to culture? Because it might be difficult to audit culture causes as individual causes.
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into how everything links into that. It was more just a way to to illustrate that the cultural thing could be pervasive. So it may not be, in fact, that all of those findings that are presented under each of those main categories actually link into culture itself. So I wouldn't read too much into that. It was more a sort of visual way to present that, yes, this could be, culture could be a significant issue, and it was only because we wanted to communicate that, in fact, sometimes culture can be pervasive, but don't read into that it necessarily has to be linked into each of those causes.
Great. Then we've got a question from Elroy asking when to use the fishbone diagram versus the problem tree.
Good question. I think they could both be used around the same time. I'm not as familiar. Like, I do know your problem tree. I have taught in South Africa before, and I was exposed to that. Very, very interesting and a very useful tool. Excuse me. With both of these tools, I think mid-exam phase is kind of one of the key areas where you first want to introduce this, because this is where your findings are starting to emerge. And this gives you an opportunity to do a mid-course correction or to put greater emphasis on a particular area if you find that, you know, there's a number of significant findings here, and they're sort of starting to explain what you're observing. So, you know, with the fishbone and the problem tree, I think mid-exam is a good time, and then to revisit it, you know, around drafting phase of the report, just to make sure that it will help you, assist you in terms of drafting the audit report and communicating the main findings and the main messages that you want to communicate. And with the fishbone, you know, it can be done on a whiteboard. You can use sticky notes so you can move things around, because, again, sometimes a finding may not belong there, and someone would argue, well, it's actually a process in planning. It's not a delivery issue. It's not really a big deal. You just move things around. It's more to precipitate that discussion, both at midpoint and at end. You know, what's the sum total of what it is we're observing, and what's lying behind that in terms of the causes of that, and how will this help us to identify what the key drivers are and what the main message of the report is. I'm a big fan of thinking about messages. Like, you have findings, then you have key findings, and then you have messages, but then you have the main message. And I often use this analogy of, you know, you jump in the elevator and you got, I don't know, 15 seconds to get to the top, and the Auditor General walks in, and he or she looks at you and says, "Okay, John, what's you're working on ABC? Well, what's the message here? What are you finding?" You don't have a lot of time to communicate that message, and that is so important, particularly in the area of SD, to say, okay, well, what exactly is the message here that you want to communicate? And everything should align up to that particular message, and that's where, you know, a problem tree or a fishbone diagram or a cause map would be very helpful. And a cause map is very, very similar to your problem tree. It's basically taking your problem tree that sort of is presented vertically and turn it on its side and do it horizontally. The benefits of the problem tree and the cause map is it builds in this question of why, and you can actually see those causal relationships a lot clearer. The fishbone is basically just this visual depiction of the sum total of all the stuff you're finding, and provides a springboard for further analysis and discussion and diagnosis. I remember teaching this one time. I was just going to say, I remember teaching this one time, and somebody in the class had said they'd used it in their audit. And I said, "Oh, really? Excellent." So they brought their laptop and plugged into the projector, and we took a look at what they had done. It was very, very impressive. So, and they said they found it, you know, in that particular case, super helpful to be able to communicate why it is they're saying what there is and what are the supporting findings that lay behind that.
We've got another question from Paris here, which might be, I think, linking to what you've just said in terms of using different models for what you want to get out of it. But the question is that sometimes a single problem has several causes. It
Yep.
could be both people and assets. How do you map that in the fishbone?
That's a very good question. I keep saying it's a good question, but you guys have really good questions. Yeah, well, you could put it in both categories. You won't really be able to determine sort of the multiple causes, and that's a good point. Like in root cause analysis, it's not always necessarily just one root cause. There could be several. So by laying out, I would, direct you to the cause map, because that it's kind of like the problem tree, in the sense it's like an organizational chart, and one branch could lead to 3 branches, and one of those branches could lead to 4 branches. And then with that, you can observe that you may in fact have multiple causes, and it may not be a single root cause that is behind something. So you have to use professional judgment at that point. One of the classic examples that comes to mind is the sinking of the Titanic. You have the ship that went down, and they say, okay, well, it hit an iceberg, yes, but what was the root cause? Did they not have proper surveillance on the deck at night? Like, why did it hit the iceberg in the first place? And then the hull of the ship, it bent. Was the metal not strong enough? And then water entered the hull. Was that because it sank? So, there's it was all of those that really led to that unfortunate disaster. So, again, at the end of the day, when we're into sort of root cause analysis here, but when you're doing root cause analysis, it's professional judgment, and there may, in fact, and often is, more than one root cause. It's difficult to pin something right to a single root cause, because you have to then make a judgment in terms, okay, well, these are pretty significant factors related to that we need to talk about. The main thing, another comment on that, the main thing about doing root cause analysis is your recommendations. So you want to make sure, whatever it is, if there's, 4 root causes you identified, you want to make sure those 4 recommendations address that, and not just the symptoms. And that's where another tool, something called the 5 whys analysis, helps you to sort of drill down into a particular finding to make sure that you're comfortable with what the cause is, so that when you make a recommendation, you're not just stating obvious. For example, you may not have an important operational plan in place, and that's your recommendation. Make sure that you draft and put in place an operational plan. Well, you do some more digging in the root cause analysis, you may find out the reason that that plan is not in place is because they don't have the trained personnel to do that properly. So your recommendation migrates from put a plan in place to make sure you have the people in place that have the skill sets necessary in order to create that plan. So with that said, I think the key to always keep in mind is, what are you going to recommend? And does your recommendation actually address the problem and not just the symptoms?
We also have I think it's a comment more than a question, from Grace, saying, I wish there was a criteria by which the causes could be profiled, graded, or ranked, so that we conclusively settle on root cause with certainty.
Yeah, for sure. I wish, but you guys know as well as I do, when there's this huge component to performance audit, and it's what distinguishes it from financial audit, of professional judgment. And you've got to, in terms of weighting causes and stuff, I think you really have to step back and look at your evidence. And teams would always say to me, well, how do I begin and what do I write? And this example, like, how do I ascertain which cause is greater than the other? Well, what's the evidence? And you need sufficient appropriate audit evidence to back up all of your findings, but the weight of evidence often can direct you to where the most significant problem is. But yeah, in an ideal world, it would be great to sort of say, okay, I got 10 causes here. What's the algorithm to help me determine what's the more significant cause than others?
Then we do have a question from Futi, asking, can we use this model, the fishbone, for quantitative data in relation to validate causes or measure impact of the problem?
Yeah, it's not my forte, that, like, particularly in financial audit, or in fact if you have numbers, but for sure. And I have spoken to many financial auditors that have actually employed this methodology in financial audit. And I think, you know, with some creativity in the context of a performance audit, you could apply it in that context as well. Haven't done that personally, but yeah, it's a fair point.
I see. I think we've gone through the questions in the chat. If there's any more questions, colleagues, please put that in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand to ask John the question directly. While you are perhaps thinking of questions, I've noted in the comment asking for a link to the recording. We will post a link to the recording on our website by tomorrow afternoon. So please have a look on our website. We will make a link to the recording available there. Richard, any questions from your side while we see if anyone else has some questions or in the chat?
No question from this side. I'm super excited for this, especially for this very last, the tail end of this. No, I think there's a hand somewhere. Maybe we can take the hand.
Yes. Isa, you've got a
Isa.
hand. You're welcome to unmute. Isa, we see your hand. You can unmute.
Isa, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. So I want to know the linkage between the upper fins and the lower fins.
Say that, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your question. The linkage between...
Yeah, I said I want to know the linkage between the upper fins and the lower fins.
Okay.
Like for example, have you got my question?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, for example.
Okay, for example, if you look at the last end, you have authority in the upper fin, and you have people in the lower fin. So I want to know the linkage between these two things.
Okay. Yeah. No, there's no criteria in terms of where those, like in the blue boxes there, we refer to those as the main categories. So whether you put them on the bottom or the top, it makes no difference. But it was just an innovative thing that the foundation did, was to identify those main categories because they're in the context of performance audit. Now, you may find another main category that's not captured. You know, like again, I mentioned before that had a lot of discussions of where corruption would fit into this. And again, we could, you know, argue that it could be placed in culture, but those can be flexible. But again, the model is pretty comprehensive, and I think you'll find your findings, no matter what they are in the context of performance audit, you can find a home in one of those or more of those main categories. And so don't look for linkages amongst the categories, but rather the findings may present themselves in one or more. And what I'd present to you is, like, you know, when we do performance audit, you know, we often send our auditors out in the field and everybody comes back and we craft up the report. But what this tool does do is, especially if you do it at midpoint in your field work, it allows everybody on the team to kind of go, okay, I see here. I see the picture emerging here. I see, well, thanks for sharing that. That's important. So, you know, you're really starting to get a better handle on where your audit's heading and where you may want to, quote, tell the story by doing this type of analysis and plotting stuff in a way that helps you understand potential linkages and where, for example, the majority of your findings are starting to occur. Like you may have different team members finding a bunch of different things, but when you plot them, you realize that, hey, they're all are related to planning here and processes that the organization has in place, right?
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isa. Colleagues, any more? So what we usually do is to plan these sessions not to take too much of your time as auditors. But I think we still have a few minutes. We could take a few more questions if you have. Otherwise, I'm excited for the excitement shown and the questions coming in through for you, John, to help
Yeah,
us
no,
go through this.
great interest, Richard. And one of the things the foundation does, and I can talk to Carolyn, the vice president there. Pretty sure she's open to it. That we do sort of team by team coaching, and I've done this several times where when a team is at the stage where they kind of got their first summary of what they're observing, we can walk them through and work with them to create a fishbone diagram to make sense of all those findings. So that is sort of something the foundation has done several times, like sort of real-time coaching with people.
That's good. That's something we can explore in the very near future. But I'm super excited, and I'm even more impressed with how you have been able to sit and run a pilot of performance audit issues. And truthfully speaking, the issues you raise on authority, on people, on delivery, on assets, these are the main categories of findings over the years that we have in performance audits. So these are things that will help us in the region as we go through these performance audits as well. So thank you very much, John. I'm not sure we have any more questions for you, but however, colleagues, if you have questions, you can still throw them out to John in the next 5 minutes or so. Otherwise, you can send the question to us here at AFROSAI-E. We will try and reach out to John and see how best we can help you get this sorted.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
I will share my email address on the chat function. Absolutely. So John, you could also share your email address if people want to reach out.
Yeah,
directly.
It's Richard, it's just my name, like John Affleck, all one word, lowercase, John Affleck at Rogers, ROGERS.com. John Affleck at Rogers.com. That's my personal address. And yeah, I'd be happy to provide some guidance or coaching. And again, like you say, Richard, those are where your findings have landed in the past in those categories. But with the sort of value added here is this now gives a tool to sort of organize that and sort of say, hey, like the majority of our findings are in fact related to authority, so it's not rocket science, but it's quite helpful to organize your thinking.
Yeah, that's true. That's very, very helpful. Thank you very much, John. Let's not take your morning. We know the day is just starting that side of town.
No, it's okay.
So
and again, my apologies at the
beginning. Go through this day.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But from this side, colleagues, thank you very much. Let me acknowledge a special group of people. We have a 3-module performance audit training happening in the AFROSAI-E offices currently. They are locked in and they are taking good lessons from this, I believe. So thank you, colleagues, for logging in, and thank you, everybody else from the region. We will see you shortly with the next webinar, which is scheduled for somewhere around November. But please be on the lookout. We'll send information out and we'll let you know if anything else comes up. Thank you very much and have a very lovely afternoon.